Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Boswell Book Company and Schlitz Audubon Nature Center virtual event series. Pull up a chair, get a drink, make sure your birds are fed, and welcome to the Boswell Book Company Schlitz Audubon Nature Center event series. It's day 4,345 of us being in business. I'm Daniel Golden, and I am going to pass things over to Michelle Allison at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. Hi, Michelle. Michelle.
Hi, Daniel, and thank you so much. My name is Michelle Allison, and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator at Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. Since I began working at the center, I've become an avid birder, and one of my favorite duties is co-hosting our bird club along with Dan Panetti of Wild Birds Unlimited in Mequon. It's been so much fun to get to know our local and migratory birds and share that experience with our seasoned and new birders alike. As I've learned more about birding, David Sibley's field guide has been my absolute go-to resource. And his new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, has quickly become one of my favorite books for all the wonderful information on bird behavior and the beautiful illustrations. So this is a thrill for me, both personally and professionally, to co-host this conversation with David Sibley and Charles Hagner. I'm happy to introduce Charles Hagner, local birding expert and friend of the center. Charles Hagner is the director of Bird City, Wisconsin. He's the board chair of the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory and a member of the steering committee of the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative. He was also editor-in-chief of Birdwatching magazine from 2001 to 2017.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be reacquainted with a person I got to work with for a number of years. You know, editing a magazine such as Birdwatching magazine afforded me many excellent opportunities for which I am immensely grateful. And one certainly was attending the convention of the American Birding Association in Lafayette, Louisiana in 2007. Because it was at that convention that I got to steal a little bit of David's busy time and to ask him to write a regular column for the magazine. And to my great surprise and to our readers' delight, David said yes. And so it's a funny thing being the editor of a magazine, but because you become friends with people you only see rarely, if at all. Generally, you communicate a lot by email. And then in this case, it was a bi-monthly surprise for me to receive this great treat of art and words that did so well what we try to do at the magazine, or we tried to do at the magazine all the time, which is to take kind of obscure, sometimes complicated material and turn it into something that any one of our readers, an expert birder or a beginner, could understand and enjoy. And that is exactly how I would describe David's new book, What It's Like to Be a Bird. I'm sure that everyone knows that David is the author of the Sibley Guide to Birds, and he's I think the editor of the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior. And he also wrote a wonderful book called Sibley's Birding Basics, which came out in 2002. He is the recipient of the American Birding Association's Roger Torrey Peterson Award for Lifetime Achievement. And he has also received the highest award of the Linnaean Society of New York, the Eisenman Medal, for excellence in ornithology and the encouragement of the amateur. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you, David. Thank you for agreeing to share this book with us and to chat with us, and welcome to all of to Wisconsin, even if it's virtually.
Yes, thank you, Chuck. Yeah, it's great to see you, and great to be there. Thanks to Boswell Books and Schlitz Audubon for arranging all of this, and thanks to everyone for coming out, for your interest in birds. I wish I could be there in person, but that's another time. So this book, what it's like to be a bird, I'll I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and it's a big departure from my field guide work, and it allowed me to do a much more artistic, imaginative illustrations of birds, which was a lot of fun. Dreaming up the poses, the arrangement, exactly what I was going to show in each painting, and one of the goals in the book was to try to use these paintings to show a wide range of behavior. So I tried to find interesting things, interesting ways to present the birds. And the idea for this book first started many, many years ago as a children's book. I wanted to try creating a bird book for children, and I started working on more of a field guide format, just an identification guide. Gradually, as I worked on that, I kept adding more and more of these fascinating facts, the amazing bits of information. And the more research I did on those, the more that became the entire book. The heart of the book became these short essays about what birds are doing and how they do all the things they do. And I was learning so much in my research, and it was fascinating work for me. Even after 50 years of studying birds, I learned so much as I researched and wrote this book. And then having the opportunity to do these fun illustrations for it was a real treat.
David, I there is a lot in the book that really surprised me, I'm a person who spent a good part of a year researching and writing a book on birds.
Yep.
and even before that, I was lucky enough to get paid to read a lot about birds. So this was really, this is how I paid the mortgage for a while, and I was surprised. So I have to wonder, like, is there a message or a lesson to be learned that even the author of the Sibley Guide to Birds can be surprised by birds still at this point?
Yeah, well, I think that there's that lesson, and that's I've been saying that for years, that I'm constantly surprised by birds. I learn new things all the time just by walking out my back door and looking at birds. I learn new things. I come up with new questions. But this, a lot of the stuff that I learned and put into this book is research that's decades old. And it's, I think the lesson there is that the scientific research is kind of a separate world from the birding community. And even, there's been a lot of people have put a lot of effort into trying to bridge that gap, the way, you did with the magazine, and a lot of others have tried to sort of bridge that gap, but still there's, a lot of this stuff, like the feathers being waterproof because of their structure. It's not exactly buried, but it's kind of hidden in some very technical research. And I think the researchers are focused on their own work and their own the real scientific aspects of what they're working on. And it's difficult to make the leap then to kind of interpret that for the non-science, or the bird fan audience. And I found myself over and over reading a paper about some aspect of bird science and running across, like, in a third of the way through a paragraph that mentions one thing, and I say to myself, that's the highlight of this paper. That little bit right there, that's the thing that is really amazing. And it's so yeah, it's, I don't know how to, I think there's still a tremendous amount of information that's known, but the people who know it tend to gloss over it and say, well, yeah, we know that, but it's more interesting. This next question is much more interesting. We're working on that one.
Yeah, I've had the same experience of reading, academic papers and then wading through lots of statistical material and then coming to something that just made me sit back in my chair and went, holy moly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think some of your conclusions, though, you write in the preface that some interesting little conclusions that you had about instinct. You know, we've all been taught, I think, that as birds go through their daily lives, they just kind of blindly follow instinct. But you know, instinct has always been kind of this vague kind of concept. And I think that what you're suggesting is that maybe there's a little bit more to it than just blindly following instinct.
Yeah, I've had that thought for a long time, and it really kind of coalesced in the research for this book, that the birds are doing these things. They're building a nest, they're migrating, and they're doing that with no guidance, no bird to bird instruction. A young Baltimore Oriole, less than a year old, flies north, finds a mate, settles on a territory and builds a nest. And they just instinctively know how to do that, which is incredible. But that's, it's not just a robotic thing where it's, it's not like, oh, it's May 15th, it's time to, I feel the urge to gather some grass and weave it together in this way. It's much more nuanced. They're making decisions about everything that they do. There's a right, they build the nest, they choose the location for the nest based on all kinds of factors. And if there's some disturbance that reaches some critical level, they'll abandon a partly built nest and start again somewhere else. And if they can't find grass, they'll use some other kind of fiber and improvise, and all of that. So it made me think that instinct has to be a much more subtle urge. It's not just a robotic program that they have to follow. It's one among many competing urges that come up, and then I started thinking about how, also in that sense, how does instinct motivate the bird to do those things? What is what happens? What is and then you get into some dangerous territory of saying, so what is the bird feeling? What's the bird's feeling that makes it build a nest? It doesn't have to be a feeling, but it's the urge. The urge to build a nest, it's motivating the bird to do that in some way. And why isn't that a feeling of satisfaction when they weave a few blades of grass together to form the first beginnings of the nest? Some feeling of, oh, that looks good. That makes me feel good. And I think of the same, I get and I think probably everyone gets this sort of irrational, satisfied feeling after you've mowed the lawn. You look out on a freshly mowed grassy lawn and it's just good. Or you know, you vacuumed the room that was starting to get a little dusty, and it feels good to have it clean and tidy. And I imagine that that's instinct in us.
Many of your essays in the book, I noticed, begin with questions. You know, and some of them sound like questions that I've been asked in the past. Like, why do birds stand on one leg? Or I thought robins were a sign of spring, but a flock just visited my yard in midwinter.
Yeah.
A bird has built a nest by my front door. What can I do? And so are these actual questions that you've been asked over the year?
Those are, yes. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I was, like I said, I was taking notes, you know, writing myself notes of questions when people ask me questions, or when I just sort of out for my morning walk or something and I come up with a question, write it down and do a little research. And usually when I started researching questions like that, I would, as I learned more, I would come up with more questions and learn interesting things that then I would work into another essay somewhere else. But yeah, it was really fun to think back to all the questions that people ask me. And really, I was focusing on more my non-birding friends and family and neighbors over the years. People who have, you know, at a barbecue or they say, "Oh, you write bird books? Let me ask you this." Those are the kinds of questions I was going for.
Mm-hmm. And you know, I noticed that in that there are no scientific names and no range maps in this book, as we saw those in the Sibley Guide to Birds and your other books. Is that part of the same impulse there to appeal to the larger audience? Or
Yeah, I guess, you know what, the very first sort of mock-up idea for this book was a field guide with range maps. And I did away with all of that, all the field guide aspects. And so yeah, the way the book evolved, it just, all that stuff sort of fell away, and it didn't, you know, it's funny now you mention it, the scientific names never even came up as a thought. I never never even considered. It just didn't seem necessary. It's not, that's not what the book is about. And I mean, it introduces people to the familiar birds. A lot of the species that you're likely to see in your backyard are in this book, and they're named. So in that way, it's an introduction to all those birds. But I did away with all of that, all that more technical aspects. And I did still, you know, I say that it started as a kid's book and then turned into something else, but I still, through all of it, I still imagine that kids are, I hope, a big part of the audience for this book. So it was really geared towards that, the level of non-birder kids, people who really didn't know much about birds.
Yeah. I was surprised by two other areas in the book, and one was, well, I'll just back up and say that one of my favorite stories when I was putting the magazine together were stories where someone lays out some interesting facts about a bird and then says science doesn't have a good explanation for that, you know. So when I read in here that we don't really quite know why vultures stand with their wings spread, or you know, we don't really know how raptors release you know, their grip on prey.
Yeah.
I thought, yes, you know, I love these kind of stories because they make me want to find out. They tell me that there's an opportunity to still learn, and they really change utterly the way that I look at vultures and raptors when I see them in the future. I always thought that they made a better story. You know, they're the best stories, that the ones that we don't have good answers for. But I was surprised that you included those in the book.
Yeah, and I agree that those make the best stories, the mysteries, the unresolved endings. And I made a conscious effort to include those kinds of things and to highlight the things that are not known, along with all the things that are. And for me, one of the most amazing unknown mysteries about birds is the alcids, like the murre. I did the illustration of the thick-billed murre diving underwater. They dive to 600 feet, more than 600 feet deep in the ocean to catch fish. And first of all, there's the pressure. Nobody knows how they survive the pressure, how their feathers resist water penetration at that pressure. And it's dark down there. Even on a sunny day, it's dark. And they don't have any extra senses that anyone knows about to catch fish. They're presumably hunting by sight, but it's dark and they're 600 feet underwater looking for fish. And they have enough oxygen to swim around down there and make it back to the surface. There's so many mysteries about what they do and how it all works. And it's just, you know, it's an incredible feat just to go down there and come back up. And so many mysteries about how they do it and what they're doing while they're down there.
Yeah, absolutely. The other area that I was really surprised and very pleased to see was that there were, I would say maybe about a dozen, maybe more of these essays where a species was used to describe a specific threat to birds. For example, like brown pelican, you described DDT. Bald eagle, there's a very affecting image of a bald eagle that has been poisoned with lead. And I know that lots of other reviewers have talked about this book coming out during the pandemic and the pandemic's effect on bird watching and everything like that. But these essays made me think about another event, and that was the publication in September of 2019 in Science of the findings that you know 3 billion North American breeding birds had disappeared in the last 50 years. And I wonder if the timing was appropriate for you to have that in your mind to include these conservation messages in the book deliberately as a result of that, or was it just a coincidence, or how did that work out?
I had planned all these essays before that paper came out, and it was the final stages of editing when that paper came out in 2019. And I actually spent some time trying to find a place to highlight that information in the book, and I couldn't, at that stage of editing, I couldn't quite fit it in. But all of those sort of conservation related essays were planned all along. And
Excellent.
And it's I think, you know, it's always one of the most difficult things about bird conservation and a headline like that, the 3 billion birds lost. There's so many different stories, so many different threats, reasons for those declines. Every species and each, even at different seasons, there are different threats for each species. So it's a complex challenge. And so I wanted to highlight these very specific aspects of conservation and kind of emphasize specific threats more than to get into just the big sort of global picture of bird declines.
Yeah, I think it's very effective. Now, I had planned to ask you about the art in the book, and we've gotten a number of questions about that. So people are very interested in the technique that you used and the materials that you used to make the beautiful paintings that start each section. I know that you use gouache for the field guides.
That's right. Yep.
But these are acrylic. Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you could just tell us like what the difference is and why you chose one for the field guides and the other for this book, that would be great.
Yeah. So I used gouache for all of the field guide illustrations, and it's opaque watercolor. Gouache, it's very easy to work with. It you can just keep a palette of colors ready, and all you have to do is dab a little water on and stir it, and you've got some color in your brush. So it's very convenient, and it works really well for the detail and texture, the subtle shadings and texture of bird feathers, bird colors. So it worked really well for the field guide. When I did the illustrations for the tree guide in the mid 2000s, like 2004 to 2009, so gouache, it does a lot of things really well, but it doesn't do green very well. Bright green, the shadings of bright green don't come out at all in gouache. So for a tree guide, obviously I switched to acrylic paint to do all the greens. And it's easier to get this sort of smooth satiny texture of the surface of a leaf, things like that. And I used acrylics for that. And acrylic, it's plastic. It's water-based paint, but but once it's dry, it's completely non-water soluble. So that means that once you put it on the paper, you can paint over it. You can keep putting layers over it, and the previous layer doesn't get picked up and mixed in with the new layer the way it does with gouache. So you can get a lot of different effects, and you can really paint over something. With gouache, there's a limit to how much you can cover. So it tends, not just greens, but all the colors are brighter, more vibrant in acrylic. Gouache is a more subtle sort of pastel shading of color. So once I got familiar with acrylic, I really liked it. It's more because of the ability to paint over other things. It's a little more forgiving. I like to, I guess I'm not very patient with painting in a way. I like to just kind of put some paint on the paper and see how it looks, and then add some more and see how that looks, and keep kind of messing around with it. And acrylic is more forgiving for that than gouache is.
Yeah.
So
yep.
I really enjoyed working with it for this book, and all the paintings are quite large. The original paintings are twice as large as what appears in the book. So, and that's so with the acrylic, I could use a large brush and be very loose and kind of sloppy with the painting, and then it's reduced down to a nice small size in the book and looks very detailed.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to ask about that because I'm a book guy and a magazine guy, so I'm always thinking in terms of like reducing or enlarging images.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of interest also in the group about the process that you used when you created the images. Did you work from photographs, or did you work from field sketches, or were there specimens that you had access to, or obviously each one of the pictures couldn't show a scene that you had seen. Some of them are just, like that mer swimming underneath the water. I don't think that you saw, but so how did that come about?
Yeah, so photographs are my primary reference material for details, but I always go back to my own field sketches and field experience, and every drawing or painting is an interpretation of the subject, and the best way to interpret that is to start with the living bird, to actually watch the bird and study it and take it all in and try to draw that. You get the richest, fullest interpretation from that. So kind of interpreting from photographs is a challenge, but I try to kind of paint from my mind, but using the photographs to make sure I get the proportions right, the shapes, the patterns, all of those details. And the paintings in this book were quite, they're very different from the field guide paintings. So in this case, there was a lot of thought and just sort of brainstorming of what each illustration was going to show, what each painting would show, and what was the best. Well, for the big portraits of birds, what would be the most interesting, the most eye-catching, the most, and to show a wide range of behavior. And then for the smaller images to just trying to think of the best illustration to complement the text, to give more information or more insight into what I was trying to explain. And I have one story about some of the big portrait paintings. They would, some of them just kind of fell into place and happened very quickly, and others took a long time. And one in particular was the pigeons. There's two pigeons on a window ledge, and they're looking down into a deep canyon in the city, down to the city street below. The building opposite is visible.
Yeah.
And those, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do for that painting. And I painted the pigeons, the birds, and my plan was to put something for them to be on the ground. And so it would be like, maybe they would be on the ground, and next to them would be someone's feet and some popcorn on the ground and a crumpled newspaper or park bench, some scene like that. But I painted the birds, the rest of the paper was white, and I just left it hanging on my wall in my studio for a while, looking at it every day. And one day it occurred to me that they could be sitting on a window ledge and looking down into a city block. And I did a couple of test sketches to see if that would actually work, and it did. It fits perfectly with the poses of the birds, the angle of the view. So it was just by chance that worked out. But there were several other paintings as well that I started with the bird, the portrait of the bird, and left the rest of the paper blank. And then it took weeks or even months to figure out what was going to go in the background.
Yeah. David, are you in your studio now? Do you have a painted bunting and
yes,
looks like a black-throated green behind you there?
Yeah.
Is that the process that you're describing? Just putting something up like that?
These, Well, there's a few, a few things here in progress. The painted bunting and the black-throated green warbler were painted years ago for. I was going to do a live painting demonstration in front of an audience in a big auditorium. So I was practicing painting, 3-foot high painted bunting and black-throated green warbler, and so these are the practice paintings that I still have, and the live painting demonstration went quite well, and I did a painted bunting about that size.
Sounds great. Hey, we've gotten several questions today about the cold and about how ducks can stand on frozen water, on ice, without their feet freezing to it, or other birds, how do they just manage a winter that's been certainly as cold as Wisconsin this year, and probably out in Massachusetts it's been pretty cold too.
Yeah.
So how do they, I know that birds have a lot of special adaptations, and many of them are in the book, so how do they manage?
Yeah, so the songbirds, they'll go into torpor, they'll reduce their body temperature overnight, and their feathers are very well insulated, or very, very good insulation. It's incredible that the body of a chickadee can be 105 degrees while the outside air is 0. And a ½ inch of feathers is all that separates that temperature difference. But they primarily they just need enough food, and then their metabolic engine gets going and keeps them warm. And they'll find little bits of shelter huddled in a hollow in a tree, or something like that. But as long as they have enough food, they can survive these incredible cold. And what's going on in birds' feet is this countercurrent circulation, which I knew about, but I had to learn a lot more about it for this book. And I was surprised to learn that it's super efficient. It's so the blood that's flowing out of the body is warm. As it leaves the body and goes into the uninsulated feet, it runs alongside the cold blood that's coming out of the feet back into the body. So as those two, the opposing directions of blood flow run side by side, as the blood is leaving the body and coming back in, and heat is transferred from the outgoing blood into the incoming blood, and you would assume that it would just be a blend of, if the outgoing blood is 100 degrees and the incoming blood is 0, that they would mix and form 50-degree blood coming back in and going out. But it's actually the way the countercurrent circulation works. The outgoing blood, as it travels alongside the incoming blood, the outgoing blood is warmer at every point along that their passage. So it's constantly transferring heat. Even when it's cooled off quite a bit, it's still warmer than the blood that's next to it that's coming in. So it's still transferring heat over. And it can be 85% efficient to the heat transfer. So, and that there's very little heat lost from the body then to the feet. But, it's an interesting question why ducks' feet don't freeze to the ice. And I'm just thinking of this now. It's a good question to research, and I didn't run across anything about it, but I wonder if there's something about the texture of their feet because when a duck hops out of the water, its feet are wet, and it hops out onto the ice that might be 0 degrees, the water on its feet is going to freeze instantly and freeze to that ice, you would think, but they don't. But there's another question. And they, I know that one extreme example is the spectacled eiders, that their wintering grounds were just discovered, just confirmed, maybe 10 years ago, in the middle of the Bering Sea, in the pack ice, where the ocean currents keep some leads of open water, and they all the spectacled eiders spend the winter there, where it's dark and extremely cold. And some of the research on them found that they used, I think, something like 4 times as much energy when they were swimming to keep warm as they did when they were out on the ice. And I think when they hop out on the ice, a lot of ducks, when it's really cold, when they hop out on the ice, they'll actually fold their feet up and tuck them into the feathers on the sides of their body. So their feet are not in contact with the ice some of the time. And it's probably at that time that the eiders are super well insulated, and they can, they don't have to use a lot of energy to stay warm. But when they're swimming and their feet are actually in the water, they were using 4 times as much energy to stay warm.
Wow.
And anyway, that's yeah, it's incredible what birds can tolerate for cold, and that the blood continues to flow even though it's leaving the body and transferring all its heat back to the incoming blood. You would think that the blood would just freeze in the feet, but it doesn't. There isn't a lot of blood flow through the feet, and what there is quite cold. But you know, these are that's another really good question. Why, if it's 0 degrees outside and something like a chickadee, those legs and toes are so slender, and the blood flow has to be so minute. You'd think it would just freeze right up.
I have I have one more question. It was I think inspired by the illustration of the shorebird flocks, the phalaropes, and how they twist and turn as they're flying over the water and the shore. But it's about European starlings. European starlings are well known in Europe for their murmurations. But try as I may, that my friend writes, he says, I haven't been able to find evidence of starlings doing that in North America. And he wonders if you're aware of any evidence of that.
Huh. No, now that you mention it, but I don't know of any massive starling roosts. It happens in Europe where there are tens of thousands of starlings all roosting together. And it's the big flocks all flying, all in the air at the same time that do that. I certainly here in the Northeast, there aren't that kind of numbers of starlings. So maybe that's the reason that they just don't have the critical mass, the density of the flock that you would need to see that kind of behavior. You do see, you know, it's one of the clues that we would use at Cape May for finding distant hawks. If you see a ball of starlings, starling was one species that would, when a hawk, a dangerous predator like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk was flying by, a group of starlings, even if it's just 30 or 50 or 100, would get up in the air and form a very tight ball and weave around. And so that's the same kind of flight behavior as the murmuration, but just a much smaller group, and they're doing it because of a predator. So that might be the answer is just you need tens of thousands of starlings.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I am going to think that maybe we should wrap this up. We've already went a little bit beyond where we thought we would.
Okay.
I think that this has been a great conversation, and I've really enjoyed it a whole lot, David. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
But I want to thank Charles Hagner for a spectacular job. Don't forget to support Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. We have a link to that as well, so you can walk the grounds and see amazing birds all year long. Thank you to Michelle Allison and to Nancy Quinn there. Thank you so much to David Allen Sibley and also to Knopf for making this event possible. And thank you everyone who came, because we wouldn't have a virtual bookstore or nature center without you. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, everyone.